Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. We hear over and over again about the fertility collapse, the crisis of modern civilizations that seem to be able to build amazing wonders but have a very difficult time reproducing families. Is there something about modernity that impacts human reproduction? Are there different pressures, different selection criteria that are being expressed in these situations? Joining me to talk about that today is Geoffrey Miller. He is a professor over at the University of New Mexico. He's an author and he's also an expert in evolutionary psychology. Thank you for joining me.
Great to be here, Auron.
Absolutely. We're also going to get into artificial intelligence, which is something that Geoffrey and I have gone back and forth on a number of times. Really interested to pick his brain on both subjects. But before we do, let's hear from today's sponsor. Wake up, America, and fuel your morning with a cup of coffee that salutes the stars and stripes. We're talking about Crockett Coffee. Their blends start with premium beans, artisan roasted in small batches in America's heartland, unlocking a rich, smooth flavor that turns your first sip into pure rally the day energy. But here's the real kicker. 10% of every dollar goes straight to Tunnel to Towers, supporting our nation's heroes and their families. So when you brew Crockett, you're not just waking up, you're standing up for the people that have put it all on the line for our freedoms. I've tried a couple of their roast options, and now I'm drinking a cup every morning. So are you ready to join the coffee revolution? Head over to crockettcoffee.com. That's crockettcoffee.com. And make sure to use the promo code THEBLAZE for 15% off your order. That's promo code The Blaze for 15% off. Hey guys, I also want to remind you before we get started that if you want to support the show, you can of course head over to blazetv.com/Auron and use the promo code Auron to get $20 off a subscription. It lets me continue to do what I'm doing here. It also gives you access to all the shows of all of our great hosts. You get the behind the scenes, everything. So if you want to participate, if you want to support what's going on here, head to blazetv.com/Auron and use that promo code Auron for $20 off. All right, Geoffrey. So like I said, we have a very obvious problem, I think, to a lot of people. We have an issue where the more we advance, the more our societies seem to get complex and create all these amazing things. We also have a serious problem with being able to reproduce that civilization. A lot of people look at the numbers and panic, but I guess the first thing before we decide what we should do about this problem is it a problem? Is this a real phenomenon that we should be worried about, or do civilizations simply go through this increase and decrease in children? What is the problem here? Is there even a problem?
It's a huge problem. I mean, civilizations continue through genetic transmission and cultural transmission. And if you're not transmitting your genes to a next generation and creating new people, your civilization dies out. And that has happened, many, many times throughout history. The key thing now with modernity, I think, contraception is central, right? Young people are still having sex to some degree, not as much as in previous decades, but they're still having sex. It's just not resulting in babies because of contraception. So we've got what we call an evolutionary mismatch, right? Where we have these instincts still to find a partner, have sex, form a relationship, maybe, hopefully find a soulmate. But if you're cutting the link between having sex and having babies, then fertility collapses. And this is a problem worldwide. It's not just America. It's not just Western Europe. Every single place where you get increasing education and increasing use of contraception, it's a problem.
I think this is the conclusion that Mary Harrington came to in her great book, Feminism Against Progress, that ultimately we're struggling with a technological development that has had these downstream effects on the rest of our society, and we haven't really decided what to do about it. The fact that we've turned female fertility to off as the default setting changes a lot about human existence. However, I will say this. I think there's a lot of truth to that. It makes perfect sense on a certain level. However, as you point out, we have seen this in other societies. Roman society very famously had great fertility problems. Number of Roman emperors, including Augustus, end up trying to legislate a way to have more children, right? We have to increase virtue and make sure that Romans are producing more Romans. Roman women are more virtuous, so they'll have more children. So, while our current crisis does seem to have a large technological component. This seems to have been somewhat of a spiritual crisis or a civilizational cycle that occurs whether we have this particular type of technology or not.
I think it is partly a cultural and spiritual crisis because, look, one of the few exceptions to the demographic collapse is Israel is still doing pretty well, right, in terms of fertility rate being closer
Even
to
though
three.
theirs is still dropping too, right? They're just
It's
doing
still
better
it
than
right.
everyone else.
It's still
Right.
dropping, but, part of it is a peer pressure effect. If you're in a society where it's normal for people to get married in their early 20s and you're kind of expected and you're under a certain amount of pressure to have at least 2, 3, 4 kids, right? And a sheeple like in this regard that if you go through your 20s and you're, working in some career that requires a huge amount of workaholism and dedication, law, medicine, academia, whatever, you just kind of think, "Oh man, I should spend my 20s just, you know, building up my prestige, my status, my income, and not even worry about family formation until your 30s." But that is the path towards insufficient fertility. It doesn't work. Um, so like when I accept PhD students, I give them a little pep talk, right? When they come to my university, I'm like, I'm pronatalist. If you want to have kids in grad school, I am going to support you as best I can. This is actually not a bad time to have kids because you have enormous flexibility if you're doing like a PhD to allocate your time the way you see fit. You can get leaves of absence. You can work around it. Whereas, man, once you get a tenure track job in academia and you're pumping out publications, building your your lab, applying for grants, you just don't have time to manage young kids. So I think there's a mismatch, of sexual instincts versus having babies that contraception addresses, but there's also
Mhm.
a kind of social mismatch between careers and family formation. It's just a sort of a bad timing issue.
So you mentioned Israel being different among developed nations, and I think it is important to look at that example, though some people are going to hem and haw in the comments, because ultimately, one of the issues that drives that, or at least in my mind, something that gives that a high degree of status in that society is the idea that this is a society that is fighting for its existence, right? It has a specific, explicit ethno-religious dimension that allows to say we have to continue, and so therefore that social duty permeates even throughout a more advanced society where other factors might drive them towards having less children. And so in a way, the fact that they are allowed to maintain a very particular type of identity that is taboo in other first world nations, I think drives a lot of that outcome.
I think that's right. And in other videos that I've seen of yours, you mentioned how multiculturalism itself tends to favor the development of a bigger, more totalitarian state. But I think another problem with multiculturalism is it sort of dilutes the concern with fertility that more sort of ethno-nationalist states like Israel, or also like the Han Chinese and China
Mhm.
face, because they feel like we're all in this together. Our fate, the fate of our bloodline, our ancestry, our descendants, rises or falls with our local community and our civilization. And my sense is that in modern America, like the idea that you have a moral duty to find a good mate early and have a bunch of kids would be treated as absolutely taboo, right? As it would be stigmatized. So I think that that's what to learn from the Israel example. If you have a real sense that you have external enemies, right, and you have a cohesive civilization with shared values, then you're just much more inclined to give respect and prestige to people who are pronatalist, who have a bunch of kids.
Yeah, well, this is I could be wrong, but wasn't this something that Robert Putnam discovered as well, that the increase in multiculturalism drives down birth rates among the native population?
Yeah, it drives down social trust and engagement with civic society, but it also seems to drive down birth rates.
So I wonder about another factor. I think I'd call this, there's probably some social science name for it, but I'd call it the striver effect, where you have a large number of people in the lower classes having children, and you have people in the upper classes having children. But what you see is that a lot of people trying to make that transition into the upper middle class stop having children because it is too difficult to move between classes, and they have to dedicate a large amount of resources. The lower classes don't care. They weren't going to ascend anyway, so there's no irresponsibility in having a larger amount of children. The upper classes can afford additional help, and where they have the what things that are sadly now considered luxury items, like the ability to stay at home as a mother. And so it's really the people in the middle there. The wider the gap gets in the ability to transition the class, the harder it becomes for people who are trying to do so to continue to have children, and you get this drop off in the middle.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you get just this whole narrative, particularly on social media, that I can't afford to have kids. House prices are going up, earnings aren't going up. Like we're all impoverished, blah blah blah. But like if you look at GDP per capita in America or Western Europe, it keeps going up. Like people are still getting more affluent. And yes, it's hard to have um, the sort of space that you might want if you're living in a fertility desert like Brooklyn or West Hollywood, right? Where, yeah, houses cost $2 or $3 million in Brooklyn. Okay. Don't live in Brooklyn, right? If you want kids, move. I know people who've done that. Um, but what people seem to think is bottom line, right? For a lot of Gen Zs and millennials is my personal status and prestige is more important than my bloodline, right? That's getting down to brass tacks. That's the decision that a lot of people are making when they say, I would rather go into one of these kind of winner take all careers like medicine, law, academia, finance, whatever, and do that striving and, try to make it. And it's like, no, you don't have to do that because look, once you have kids, you will go into parent mode. And the meaning that you get in life will be mostly from your kids and your partner and parenting together. And you'll reconnect with your own parents because now they're grandparents, blah, blah, blah. And so people just have this inability to imagine like family life being happy and fulfilling, right? Versus their status seeking, the runaway status seeking that they're doing in their careers.
But I think this is a problem that we see over and over again that is very difficult to solve, to get people to understand that value. And what we end up with is this situation where we have these large cities or universities, just these population centers, and they skim all the IQ off of the top of the country. They draw them into these centers, and then they just shred it, right? These just become IQ shredders because they, are financializing the economy or something rather than passing on their genes. So South Korea is going to have a much better GDP than North Korea. It will also cease to exist before North Korea. And so the economic factor, the line going up, the GDP, is obviously insufficient. I mean, you're making a point which I think is valid, that look, when people were extremely poor, they had 8 children, and you have much more money now, but you're saying you can't afford to have children. However, there has to be another dynamic to this, because otherwise we wouldn't see people continuously even getting ridiculously rich and still burning their IQ in these IQ shredders. There has to be another incentive structure that's driving this.
Yeah, I like this term IQ shredder. And, I've worked in academia for a long time, and I used to think of academia as mostly it's a center for collecting and passing along and disseminating knowledge. But if you see the dark side, right, that it attracts highly talented people, it burns through their most fertile years, right? And it shreds their IQ at a kind of multi-generational level, right? It's kind of tragic. That's a very dark view of universities. It's also a very dark view of cities. And ever since the Middle Ages, right, as people migrate from rural areas into cities, often their fertility drops as soon as they get into the cities,
Right.
right? Survival rates all partly because of plagues and infectious disease. Um, so I have very, very mixed feelings about both kind of big cities as cultural meccas and universities as knowledge meccas, because this is the unintended side effect is that it just burns through fertile years at a massive scale.
So I guess the question becomes at this point, is this just the effect of modernity? We've already talked about the, contraception and that technological advancement, but whether we're seeing this as a particular instance of a technological advancement or we're seeing this as a larger life cycle of civilizations, is modernity kind of the great filter? Is this why we're not running into aliens out there? Because once you hit a certain complexity of societies, do you just naturally start crashing your birth rate no matter what you do? Because I know there are governments like Hungary and others that have worked to heavily incentivize childbirth, and that's had some positive effect, but nothing near what it would take to actually reverse these trends. Is this something that we can even change, or is there a point at which intelligence, or at least a level of technological advancement, is actually an evolutionary downside where it actually starts working against us?
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this for a long time. I mean, in 2001, I published my first book, The Mating Mind, which analyzed sort of how sexual selection through mate choice shaped human evolution over the last few million years, right? And then in 2008, I published this book, Spent, that tried to analyze kind of runaway consumerism and runaway status seeking and careerism, partly to analyze why aren't people having kids? Why are they over-investigating, over-investing in, you know, conspicuous careerism and workaholism and status seeking and consumerism, and not in family formation. Um, and I actually published a piece in 2007 on the Fermi paradox and the Great Filter, and I posited that as technology gets better and better, entertainment technology in particular, like video games or virtual reality, it will get better and better at feeding our brains what I call fake fitness cues, which is the mistaken impression that we are doing very well, like, oh, I'm vanquishing my enemies in Call of Duty, or I'm building like fake civilizations in the game Civilization, or I have like AI waifus or fake sexual partners, AI girlfriends, whatever. And that can be a massive distraction from actually forming families. So I think that is probably one of the great filters. The the ray of hope, the light at the end of the tunnel there in both the Spent book and my Fermi paradox piece was there's going to be a subset, some niche subcultures that resist that
Mhm.
kind of entertainment technology, that resist the runaway, sensation seeking. And they'll probably be mostly religious fundamentalists, right, or pronatalists of one sort or another. And they will make a conscious decision to reject basically modernity, but particularly in the form of interactive, addictive entertainment systems. And they'll go, we care more about having kids. And then fast forward 1,000 years, right? And humanity will be descended mostly from those people.
Yeah. No, that was gonna be my next question is, are we at an evolutionary bottleneck where instead of selecting for fitness and the ability to maintain a calorie count, we're actually now selecting for the ability to reject the simulacrum, right? To
Mhm.
throw the Skinner box out. Is that gonna be the new most important thing that develops from, many people look at this as the time of abundance, but will it be seen as the moment in which humanity actually pivoted the way that it selects for and understands success in mating, because it's got to now choose not only how to make it through a specific disease or grow enough wheat, but how to actually avoid the traps that it's made for its own brain.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it could easily be a civilizational and genetic bottleneck. Um, like one thing I loved about the TV series The Expanse is the notion that the people who build the multi-generational starship to get to another star system to start colonizing the galaxy are the Mormons,
Right.
right? The Mormons get their act together because they have the long view, right? They want to be humans actually colonizing the galaxy and not just like AI robot probes. And that's their priority. And everybody else is kind of just running around doing their status seeking and their conflict and their warfare and whatever. And meanwhile, it's uh, various forms of religious fundamentalism that provide the kind of scaffolding for pronatalism.
So anyone who's playing their Auron bingo card right now knew I was going to mention this, so you can just go ahead and take your spot. If you won something, let me know. I'll award the prizes at the end. So Oswald Spengler is one of my favorite thinkers, and one of the things, well, I guess two things come to mind. One is he understood us as a Faustian civilization, one which would always and ever need to expand. And this constant drive to expand was going to take us to, if we got to the end of exploring a space, we would create new spaces, right? We would create them out of whole cloth so we could continue to go. And so in many ways, the end of the frontier for the Faustian man required a digital frontier because we have to consume and explore and expand something. And so I wonder if this is a specific cultural, I mean, I think this is a general human trait, but it is very pronounced in a particular cultural form with a Faustian man. And then my second question based on Spengler would be, he also believed that civilizations go through life cycles, morphological life cycles, and that in the winter, you usually see basically the idea of motherhood fall out of fashion. It becomes no longer something that grants status. And once having a family becomes a conscious decision, that's basically the end of your civilization. Like you just hit the clock starting, because once it's no longer a classic rhythm of life, you're going to run into this problem until basically you run out of children. And the only way that this ever solves itself is basically what he called a return to the land, where everyone becomes simpler again, where civilization more or less unwinds itself. It doesn't necessarily have to collapse so much as people no longer attend to it in any serious way, and it decays over time, and people simply return back to the rhythms of life because the complex society required to create the incentive structure that reduced births basically just wears away.
Yeah, and I mean, if you have a society where it requires a heroic individual decision to say, nobody else I know is getting married in their 20s, but I'm going to do it. Nobody else I know in my 20s is having kids, but I'm going to do it. That guarantees failure as a civilization. So you can't just rely on kind of appealing to individual decision making, right? Because it's just way too easy for kind of neoliberal economists to go, well, having kids is really expensive and it'll interfere with your career and it'll reduce GDP per capita. And like, here's all the economic reasons why continuing your bloodline doesn't make economic sense, right? And it's hard to buck against that, right? If you don't listen to like podcasts like yours, or you know don't read Spengler or whatever, we need much more of a social consensus, right? Like existed in the 50s and 60s, early 60s, right? That said it's normal. It's normal to find a mate and have kids, and to do it pretty early.
So I guess the next question is there a solution here beyond just moving through the bottleneck? Obviously that selection is going to occur. You've already said that religious fundamentalist religious communities, very serious religious communities, are going to have a big advantage in this. You're also part of I guess you call it the rationalist community. Is that probably the right term? And a lot of people in the rationalist community have had different solutions to this, because in many cases they find it difficult to be traditionally religious. And so some of them have decided to manufacture their own religion that will encourage the production. Some have decided for alternative formations and all these other things. Is there a way to socially engineer the birth rate, or does it have to be organic? Is it something that must come from outside the rationalist mind, something like a religion or a strong nationalist identity that creates those incentives apart from any kind of rationalist dictate? Or is there really a way to just science yourself through this issue?
That that's actually a very deep question, and I'm not totally sure. I mean, there's one kind of pathway that I've seen many young men take. Right? They're smart. They go to college. They discover rationalism. They discover uh, less wrong. They start reading Eliezer Yudkowsky. They become Bayesians. They start to analyze everything in very kind of utilitarian terms. That doesn't actually work very well for them in terms of delivering meaning and value to their lives. And then they become post-rationalist, right? Which means they kind of rediscover tradition and conservative thinkers, and sometimes rediscover religion. I know people who've gone from being like hardcore new atheists to like joining the Russian Orthodox Church, right? And becoming preppers and moving to Kentucky and like finding a wife and having 5 kids. So like that's a path that one can take. It's not like millions of people are doing it though. So how do you change the culture? Well, certain people have enormous amounts of power. Like if Elon Musk actually prioritized pronatalism, right, rather than prioritizing AI and X and SpaceX and all that, he could have an enormous influence, right? Um, Even if certain influential celebrities, right, became role models for like, I'm actually Mel Gibson, right? He got canceled hard multiple times, but he's got like 9 kids, right? And he's worth about $400 million. And if he wasn't absolutely kind of like stigmatized and blacklisted by Hollywood, right? And if people had paid attention to what Mel Gibson has to say, then he could be kind of like a pronatalist icon, right? So certain individuals have the power to change the culture. And then others of us, like I guess you and me, are trying to do it at a kind of more grassroots, like humble, bottom up kind of level, and just spread ideas that we hope will get taken up and appreciated by people.
Do you think ultimately that this is something that governments are going to get more proactive about? Like I said, we've seen the Hungarian government. Other governments have pushed large amounts of uh, immigration as the solution to this, which we've already talked about. Is it's just feeding the monster, because not only are you reducing the chance that your native population will have children because you're increasing diversity, but you're also importing a lot of people who will immediately drop their fertility rate the minute they move into your country and experience the impact of modernity in your country. And so you're just importing a large number of people who themselves will cease having children. So it's an extremely temporary solution. Do you think that we're going to see kind of a reverse one child policy from a number of nations as these problems build, or is this a problem that governments simply cannot outrun?
In principle, governments could do a good job of this, but in practice, I think most government um, bureaucrats and think tanks and policy wonks are very captured by a sort of very narrow economist mindset about what really matters, right? GDP über alles, right? I actually know a colleague, Professor Norm Lee, who's at Singapore Management University, and he's talking directly with Singapore government about how do we increase birth rate in Singapore. It's been a huge problem. Like Lee Kuan Yew, founder of Singapore, worried about it for decades and kind of gave up on fixing it.
They're the most
But
classic IQ shredder available. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And um, the, the trouble is, I think governments are paying a lot more attention to economists than to, let's say, evolutionary psychologists or evolutionary geneticists or people who are actually used to thinking in terms of inheritance and ancestry and descendants and the continuity of life across generations. Economists just don't think that way. And when they, like economist Gary Becker, it's ridiculous, right? They just don't understand marriage, kids, family formation. So I'm rather pessimistic about governments having the types of brains needed to solve this.
So that takes me to my next question, because I wanted to think about it this way. We know the problem is the lack of perpetuation of these societies, but the choice to slow down and deprioritize economic concerns or the geopolitical protection of power is often seen as a step away from the race to global hegemon, right? And if there's one thing about the metaphysics of power, we know it's that power always wants to centralize, power always seeks to expand its control. And so the short term incentive for governments is always to fight for that hegemony and ignore the long-term prospects of their population, is there a pivotal moment at which sheer ability to reproduce is going to outrun economic success or technological advancement? Because that seems to have been the solution so far. I can automate my way out of this. I can create new AI. I can create a robot. I can create a better weapon. Something about financializing my economy a little more is going to bring me exponential advantages that populations simply won't leverage. But will we ever hit a moment where perhaps the lack of marginal utility in these other advancements will fall behind the core need to produce a population?
I think you're right. I think that's a major failure mode. If you have, governments that are run by sort of leaders and thinkers and policy wonks who are just thinking in terms of geopolitical competition, right? In the relatively short term, like Russia, China, the US, what's going to happen in the next 10 years? How many aircraft carriers should we build? Right? That sucks all the energy and time and money and thought out of these broader, longer scale, like civilizational, uh, pronatalist issues. And I think at a certain point, you need a culture that empowers voters to rise up and say, dudes, we don't actually care about America being number one in terms of geopolitical military hegemony. We don't care about that. We want to have kids. We want our bloodlines not to die out. I want my parents to be grandparents of a lovely set of grandkids. That's what we care about. And your little hubris driven fantasies of world domination are no longer of interest to me. Now, I think to some degree, right, the election and then re-election of Trump was a push in that direction,
Mhm.
right? To say it's okay for America to be great, but not necessarily to be the world dominating superpower, the world's policeman. But man, it's hard for any individual politician to push back against the military industrial complex and the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies that are just used to sort of like, well, the serious business of government is global hegemony, right? And if you're not on board with that, you're, a trivial and superficial thinker.
Well, Tucker Carlson has been somebody who I think has been pushing this message very much among conservatives. For my entire life, I was a talk radio conservative. I believed all the things you would expect from a Rush Limbaugh, Dennis Prager, and Sean Hannity listener. And I spouted all of those, bromides. And one of the things that, Tucker Carlson has been pointing out, if you want to conserve anything, you have to care about families. You have to care about the ability of your children to have children. That is actually the only thing that matters. It is the only thing worth conserving. And so I think that message is starting to really speak to people. However, we're running into a serious problem. A lot of people are looking at these successful quasi-communist politicians is it Zoran Mamdani in New York and others talking about the
AOC,
need. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, many others. And so they're starting to panic, and they don't understand because they say, "Look, we know communism fails. We know communism fails. How could you support this? How could you go after this?" And the answer that Tucker Carlson has given, and I agree with, is look, if you create a system where people cannot have children, it doesn't matter how irrational the other systems are, they will overthrow your system and they will embrace those systems because what they do know for sure is that the system they are in right now is not producing the outcome necessary for them to perpetuate themselves, which is like the most basic drive of most human beings. And so is a big part of the attempt by young people to explore socialism and communism are they just economically naive? Are they brainwashed by the progressive system? Or is this a deeper revolt against the system that is keeping them from reproducing?
I mean, to psychoanalyze Gen Z and younger millennials a little bit, and I can do that because I'm a psych professor, so
There
I
you
have
go.
a licensed
You're official. Yeah.
psychologist, right? A lot of young people are like, "There's a hole in my soul. There's a dark patch in my life. There's a lack of meaning, right?" And I am told that this is because of what? Some external enemy. This is because of capitalism. This is because of careerism. This is because of, runaway environmental degradation. This is because of climate change, blah, 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 blah. And they don't realize if they have kids, surprise, surprise, that wound in their soul would heal, right? And their drive to be useful, to be empathic, would finally get channeled where it's supposed to be channeled, to their kids and their mate and their extended family. And voila, meaning flowers in their lives. Now, if you don't do that, if you go through your 20s and you don't have kids, you don't find a mate, yeah, it's not fulfilling. And so you're extremely susceptible to any cult out there, right? And the first rule of every cult, right, is you uh, at least short-term cults, you discourage uh, marriage and kids because you
Right.
want all energy to be directed into proselytizing the cult, right? You don't want it to be, and same with communism, right? One child policy, or preferably no kids. Just spread the ideology instead of spreading your genes. So yeah, I think that there's a susceptibility to extremist ideologies. And I think the counterweight to that is pronatalism.
So, speaking of adherence to radical ideologies, one of the most concerning trends, and again, this is not just America, South Korea famously has this very badly. Men and women basically separating into different political parties, right? We're creating this scenario where, and I've said this, you can tell me if you think there's any truth to this. I think men are trying to replace women with technology, and women are trying to replace men with the state. And so this is why you're seeing the extreme split into these different political parties, again, not just in the United States, but other developed nations as well. There seems to be an incentive, especially in these kind of liberal democracies. You need to divide, right? The political incentive is to wedge, wedge, wedge. Every time you break apart a classic traditional bond, you release energy that can then be consumed by the state and by other entities inside society to maintain the things that were once functions of traditional units like the family. And so by dividing families, and this was a lot of anti anti why can I suddenly not remember it? Anyway, those who opposed the 19th Amendment, who were female, said the issue, suffragettes, there we go. The reason that they voiced was they were afraid that it would break the family apart, that it would divide the family, that the men and women would have different interests. This was, of course, seen as quaint and backwards at the time. But it's very clear that we are manifesting this by no longer understanding the basic unit of society as the family, but instead the individual. We've created an incentive structure where individuals go to separate political parties and lobby them to replace the other sex rather than taking the time to invest in and build those structures that undergird society.
Yeah, so I think that's partly right. I think the young women are going to anti-Trump rallies while the young men are going to OnlyFans and Pornhub. Um, I mean, I think it's great women have the vote, but it is kind of funny that, like, my own parents spent 50 years canceling out each other's votes. They voted every single election. My dad was staunch anti-communist Republican. My mom was kind of a bleeding heart liberal Democrat, but at least they provided a role model of civic engagement for me. Um, I think a particularly toxic thing, though, is like the actual differences between the sexes. Yes, they're significant and they're growing, but there's still a large number, tens of millions of young people who could actually get along with a mate if they found one. And yeah, maybe the male on average is a little more conservative on lots of issues than the woman, but instead we get the polarization amplified on social media with the manosphere preaching to young men that all women are insane, woke, liberal AOC supporters, right? And the gender feminists preaching to young women that all men are
Right.
witless Trump MAGA supporters, right? And that's just not true. So, one problem, I don't know if we can pivot a little bit to like dating apps, but some dating apps exacerbate this problem, right? Like OkCupid used to be a great dating app about 10, 12 years ago. But then 2015, 2016, the owners of OkCupid basically said, we hate Trump. We are going to game the algorithm and game the preferences that you can express on this dating app to make it very, very easy for young women to avoid any conservative men, right? We're going to make it possible to politically filter in the dating app for anybody who's like MAGA supporter. And it succeeded, and it broke OkCupid, and now it's like dropped in its ranking as a dating app. And I think we need maybe to discover new ways using technology to kind of allow the centrist or at least reasonable young people to find each other more effectively.
Well, that's a good thing to move to because I wonder, as you point out, the majority of mate finding has now moved to these apps, and it used to be that there was a large amount of intermediate institutions where people would pair up. Obviously, arranged marriages existed, but also you had churches, you had civic organizations, you had all these third places that people would regularly congregate in, and those would normally create some sort of sorting mechanism that would then allow people to find people of like mind, like values, similar goals, these kind of things, and allow them to move forward in a positive way in their dating experience. Today, we have stigmatized almost all public approaches when it comes to dating. It's you're not allowed to talk to each other, you're not allowed to look at each other. If you do, you might end up on social media because you were looking at a girl at the gym, or you were embarrassing yourself by talking to a man who wasn't interested. Like these are all this constant surveillance and this constant ability to be rejected, not just by the individual who you were pursuing, but society at large for trying to show interest, is itself just this devastating thing. And so everyone has been driven to these dating apps, especially because most people now would have met people through work. But even that is now so incredibly taboo because one slip up at work and now you've destroyed both of your careers along with your dating life. And so the dating app is kind of the only place to go. But I'm very worried about this. I'm sure some dating apps are better than others, and perhaps this is just old man shaking fist at sky. But I do feel like this is another instance of the simulacrum, right? If we place an algorithm, no matter how ethical we try to pretend the algorithm is, between us and mate selection, we're putting an artificial intelligence between us and our actual choices here. We're putting someone else's influence, we're putting a hyper agent between us and where we're going to move both genetically and socially and spiritually. And I don't know if this is an actual solution so much as a temporary band-aid and a problem that's going to continue to be exacerbated by the way that we're managing our society.
Yeah, I think those are legit concerns, and most dating apps so far have like economic incentives that are not at all aligned with the reproductive interests of their customers and users and clients, right? So if you sign up for a Tinder or Hinge and you're paying your monthly fee, right, they have an incentive for you not ever to find a marriage partner,
Right.
right? Because that means you're no longer a user, you're not in the mating market anymore, they can't monetize you. So you need a dating app that has um, economic incentives on the part of the actual app developers that are aligned with the interests of the users, in much the same way that when parents were kind of scouting around the neighborhood and the church looking for like a possible future son-in-law, daughter-in-law for their own kids, right? They have their genetic interests very much aligned with those of their kids, right? And of course, the kids never really appreciated that, right? But what you ideally want is a kind of return to both real life matchmaking, in the sense that parents rediscover, right, their agency and their wisdom in terms of helping to guide their kids into finding a good mate, and they use their social network and their professional network to like identify those potential mates and make introductions, right? And this isn't arranged marriage, this is facilitated matchmaking, right?
Hmm.
It's nobody's saying to the daughter, you have to marry this like old wealthy guy so we can inherit, this family can inherit the land, or we can make a medieval political allegiance, right? It's just like the people who care about you, your family and friends, are kind of your scouts, right? They're looking out for potential mates out there. And the great advantage parents have, right, compared to like a 22-year-old looking, is the parents know their own kids better than the kids know themselves at that point, right? The parents often have a much more accurate view of like the actual intelligence level, the personality traits, the mental health quirks, the objective attractiveness of their own kids. And the kids are often just actually quite delusional about a lot of these things. So I think, part of the answer is encouraging extended families to be more assertive and support your kids' um, marriage and family formation, and not just support their education and careers.
Well, we are already stacking up a number of questions, and I haven't even gotten to the other subject I wanted to discuss with you, which is artificial intelligence. So maybe we have to break that. Maybe we can do this again and break that into its own discussion, because I definitely wanted to pick your brain on this. We've crossed paths in that discussion many times, and that is something that I definitely want to explore. But we might have timed out on this one. So before we go to the questions of the people, is there anything you want people to check out? I know you've got several books. Is there anything you want to direct people towards?
Um, yeah, I've got a bunch of 6 books or something. I mean, the things people might be interested in most is if you're kind of into where did humans come from and why did we evolve the way we did. The Mating Mind book from 2001 is good. If you're curious about how could you take a kind of evolutionary psychology perspective on careerism and consumerism and kind of modern culture, my Spent book is good. If you want dating advice, I did a book with Tucker Max called Mate in 2015. And I also did a little edited collection of essays called Virtue Signaling, Darwinian Politics and Free Speech. So you can check those out. I'm also doing some consulting work with a new dating app called Keeper. And Keeper is explicitly about helping young people find serious marriage partners and having kids. And it's like the anti-Tinder, right? It's really trying to solve this demographic collapse problem.
Well, certainly hope that you are successful there. Like I said, I don't know if those are ultimately the solution, but if there is at least one app that is aligned properly, that certainly can't hurt in that regard. So, guys, please make sure that you are checking out Mr. Miller's work, and let's head over to the questions of the people real quick here. Philosophical Thirstworm says, "It's rough out there. I'm well off with a house, but I've lost 2 girlfriends to millionaires, and one of those guys lost her to a richer millionaire."
Mhm.
Yeah, no, nothing. It's, of course, a lot of this is who you're reaching out to, of course, again, but yeah, it's obviously a situation where, I mean, we didn't even get into all the incentives there, but there are very few um, guys competing for a larger pool of women at this time. The dynamics have changed with the breaking away of kind of a more culturally asserted monogamy, and so that I think that's a experience a lot of men are having these days.
Yeah, I think it's just important to remember that for both men and women, wealth was only invented a few thousand years ago, and when our ancestors were choosing their mates, they were focusing on traits that actually predicted like long-term ability to survive and raise kids, which were like intelligence, conscientiousness, emotional stability. In the modern world, to some degree, right, the ability to earn income is a signal of those traits, right, and
Mhm.
that's one reason why it's valued. So it's not fair to say women are just materialistic gold diggers. Often what they're doing is like they're using wealth as a proxy for
Mhm.
those other traits. But one thing we emphasize again and again and again really hard in the mate book is there are other ways to show those desired traits beyond wealth. And a lot of young men, it's weird, like they'll put huge amounts of effort into maximizing their future expected income, and they'll put like zero effort into their artistic skills, their sense of humor, their musical skills, their conversational skills, all the stuff that's like ordinary, everyday indicators of intelligence and talent.
George Hayduke says, it is to be understood as an essential metaphysical turn towards death. Nothing availed to check the process. Oswald Spengler. Yep, that was the passage that I was referencing there.
Mhm. Yeah.
Florida Henry says, is it now better for North Korea as a people to not join South Korea? I mean, I know this sounds like a joke, but it's something I think about a lot. We have a society that is far more liberal, far more wealthy, far more, the rights of the people respected. All these things, all the things that you and I would probably select for when selecting a society to live in, and it's losing badly. And so, I have to, wonder. You look at these different societies, and I wouldn't want to live in them. But who's going to win, Afghanistan or the UK? Right? Who's going to
Yeah.
win, North Korea or South Korea? All of these things that we think of as indicators of civilization and affluence, and being a productive society, and it is the gradient at which we want our society to move towards these things. They're all the things that ultimately seem to bring about ruin in this way, at least to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine a very edgy propaganda campaign against immigration, like to America, that says to like the middle-aged and grandparents in other countries, just be aware, if you send your young people to America, we are the IQ shredder, we are the gene shredder. You will not have nearly as many grandkids or great grandkids as you would if they stayed near you, right, in your local village where there is support and there's more of a pronatalist culture. And in a way, it's unbelievable to me that so many middle-aged parents in these developing countries are like, oh, I want a better life for my kids, so they should go to a first world country. Well, yeah, a better life, but then no more next generation lives,
Right.
right?
Yeah. No, it's a continual problem, and it again, you don't want to say, oh well, you're better off in these scenarios, but on the long term, what will be around? Just the
Mhm.
basic question, not would I even want to live there, but just will that civilization continue or not? Seems to be a real question for many of the civilizations that we think of as the most advanced and the ones you would like to live in the most. Machiavelli sucks says we have to stop caring too much on how women feel. Of course, having a baby is inconvenient and takes a year. Well, I don't think that's going to be a message that sells. So we might want to rethink your pitch on this one. If anything, I think the way that you'd want to phrase that, and Jeffrey can tell me if I think that's right or not. You need to elevate the status of women having children. You need to start having caretaking, motherhood, the binding of social activities that women often fulfilled. You have to find a way for that because all of this is status at the end of the day, right? The reason that men and women don't want to have children, yes, it's hard and everything else, but they would do the hard things. They do other hard things if they think it's going to get them status. The reason they don't have kids, the reason they go out of their way, they act as if having a child is like cancer, is because it reduces their status and their earning potential, which also reduces their status. And so I think rather than just being like, well, don't cry, women, this is going to be inconvenient for you. Of course, you have to find a way to properly incentivize women, and that's going to come in some way tied to elevating the status of women who do go through this process.
Yeah, and I think the collapse of babysitting as something that teenage girls do is partly responsible for
Mm,
this. Like when I was growing, I'm Gen X, right? So I grew up in the 70s and 80s. Every girl I knew in high school, every girlfriend I had been a babysitter. They'd had experience taking care of babies and toddlers. They knew like, oh, it's challenging at first, but you do get used to it. It's a skill that you can master. It's not some scary alien thing, right? And but a lot of young women have like zero experience of childcare, and they're not exposed to kids. One of my other radical and very cheap, but I think possibly effective ideas is every college campus should have more children's playgrounds on it. Young women should get exposed to seeing kids playing, right? Most campuses have wonderful green places. My University of New Mexico campus is one of the more beautiful areas of Albuquerque, but the local parents never take their kids there because there's nowhere to play. There's no playground equipment. So if you wove together kind of the parenting life and like educational life, so that young women get to see, oh, there's other women out there. They're only a few years older than me. They have kids. Maybe I should talk to them. They look happy. Like maybe that's something that's achievable that I could do, right? So I think telling young women like it's really hard and it's expensive, but you need to do it anyway for the good of your bloodline.
Right.
Right? That's not nearly as compelling as just seeing, oh, there's other people doing this successfully, and they seem like they're still happy, and they're still smart people, and they have interests, and it's working out okay for them.
Yeah, you're really talking about what Spangler said. Make it a rhythm of life, right? Make it it's something that is, of course, you walk by and there are children around you. Of course, there are children in public events. Of course, public events are oriented towards people who have families and are bringing their children to those events. Make that something that is no longer isolating you away from society, but instead is introducing you to a wider part of society. I think that reorientation, I don't know if it's the ultimate solution, but I think it is certainly something that can change the dynamic in an important way. Uh, I don't know how to say that. Pinoid news. I figured this out. It's called communitarianism out of the Appalachian Gorilla on Substack, local agriculture and community rights. Well, I will say that I think that scale is a huge problem with this. I think that people who are way above Dunbar's number in their average, everyday interactions, who never bind with a certain number of people, are always going to have a problem with understanding this need to perpetuate a community, having a duty to continue a way of life. I think that there is a maximum number of people that you can try to share an existence with and still want to continue that existence. And so I do think that along with the either highly rationalist incentive structure or the highly religious incentive structure, scaling down is going to be a critical part moving forward, because I think smaller intentional communities are going to be far more interested in supporting each other, creating the environments that Geoffrey and I are talking about, and ultimately wishing to pass that way of living on to the next generation.
Yeah, and I mean, people also need to rethink issues like housing law and zoning rights, and you need to be able to allow like-minded people, to form cohesive communities that they want, rather than this kind of isolated single-family house system where it's extremely hard to put together a cohesive neighborhood of like, if you want like we want to take this whole street and kind of turn it pro-natalist, like, oh no, you're not allowed to discriminate about who lives next to you. It has to be a completely atomized set of families. I think that's a real structural problem.
I'm going to ask you a very spicy question here. You don't have to answer it, but how big of is the problem is a civil rights act to actually creating these kind of communities?
It's a huge problem. I mean, it's part of the multiculturalism problem that if you look from my perspective as an evolutionary psychologist, right, who's read a lot about hunter gatherers and tribal societies, small scale societies, the fundamental right of a tribe is to determine who is in the tribe and who isn't, to determine who gets to live near you and who doesn't get to live near you. And if you can't do that, you don't really have a community, right? If you can't determine geographically who is permitted to live next to you and who isn't, and there's no structure of local organization above the level of the nuclear family, right? Um, that's voluntary based, that's community based, then it's really hard to have any sense of cohesiveness and kind of authentic connection to your community, right? B, it's hard to feel safe, right, if you have no say over who your neighbors are. And C, it's hard to find people with shared values, like let's all raise our kids together and trust that if they play with each other, that those other parents like will be responsible adults, right? Trustworthy and safe.
Right. If they'll even share your standards for what a trustworthy adult is, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, and so that's ultimately a huge issue. And I just don't, I don't see the ability to build the type of communities you're talking about without addressing that at some level. But obviously, one of the huge problems is that the state can't scale if you have strong tribes, if you have strong communities. which is why the state's incentive is always to destroy tribal and communal loyalties, because otherwise they're going to have a hard time building you into a larger infrastructure. So good luck trying to talk the state into adjusting any of those understandings. Let's see. Amasio Currency says, "Save the country and abolish the 19th." Well, best of luck. That's not how the incentive structure for the franchise works. Once you have an expanded franchise, the only thing that ever happens is you expand the franchise more. I have a hard time thinking of anything that didn't involve a revolution in which the franchise was radically scaled back. No matter how you feel about that particular expansion, it's probably here until the vote itself is gone.
Yeah, I mean, my radical idea for expanding the franchise is every kid should get a vote, but until the kid is 18, that vote is kind of split between the biological parents who can do like a proxy vote on behalf of their kids. I think that would be a very interesting direction to go, and I think it would help reduce the impact of childless libs on the political process.
Yeah, it's basically a modification on the old patriarchal ability to vote for the family.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Matt Gradier says, "Great work, Auron and Geoffrey." Well, thank you very much, man. I appreciate you supporting the show. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wind that one down. But it was great speaking with you, Geoffrey. Really appreciate you coming on. And of course, we will probably try and do another one of these because, like I said, didn't even get to touch the AI topic at all. But guys, make sure you're checking out his work, several books, and everything else that you can look at. If it's your first time on this channel, please make sure that you subscribe on YouTube. Click the bell, notification, all that stuff so you know when we go live. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.